Germany, April 1945. Rain fell cold and steady on the ruined village of Aachen, turning rubble to mud and mud to rivers that ran brown through streets where buildings had stood days before. In a bombed-out cellar, 11 German boys sat with their backs against damp stone walls, waiting. The youngest was 13, the oldest 16, all conscripted into the Volkssturm 3 weeks earlier, all captured that morning by American infantry advancing through the collapsing Western Front. They'd been taught that capture meant summary execution, that Americans showed no mercy to defenders. When heavy boots descended the cellar stairs, the boys closed their eyes and waited to die. Instead, a voice said, "Any of you kids speak English?" The boy who spoke was named Peter Keller. He was 14 years old, from a village outside Stuttgart, and he'd learned English from his grandmother, who'd lived in London before the Great War. It was basic English, classroom phrases, and simple vocabulary, but enough to understand when the American sergeant standing in the cellar doorway asked his question. Peter raised his hand slowly, terrified, expecting the admission to make him target rather than translator. The sergeant, a tall man with tired eyes and 3 days' worth of stubble, gestured for him to stand. "Come here, son. Nobody's going to hurt you." Peter stood on legs that trembled so badly he could barely walk. The other boys watched him with expressions of terror and pity, certain they were witnessing his final moments, grateful it wasn't them, and guilty for that gratitude. The sergeant studied Peter in the dim light, filtering through the cellar's broken ceiling. Rain dripped through gaps in the rubble above, creating small pools on the stone floor. Outside, the sounds of war continued: distant artillery, the occasional rifle shot, the rumble of vehicles moving through destroyed streets. "How old are you?" "14, sir," Peter managed in careful English. The sergeant closed his eyes briefly, an expression of weariness so complete it seemed to age him visibly. Jesus Christ. They're sending children now. He opened his eyes, looked at the other boys huddled against the wall. "How old are the others?" 13 to 16, sir. "We are ... we're ... Volkssturm. Home defense. Home defense." The sergeant's voice was flat, emotionless, but something in his expression suggested anger barely contained. "You're kids. You should be in school, not fighting in a war that's already lost." Peter didn't know how to respond to that. The regime's propaganda had insisted victory was still possible, that every German man, woman, and child had a duty to resist the invaders to their last breath. But Peter had been in uniform for 3 weeks. He'd seen enough of the chaos, the desperation, the complete absence of supplies or coherent command structure to know the propaganda was lies. Germany had lost. The only question was how many more people would die before someone officially admitted it. "Sir," Peter said quietly, "are you going to ... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the word execute, couldn't voice what they all expected. The sergeant understood anyway. "No, we don't shoot prisoners, son. Especially not kids who were forced into uniform by a dying regime." He turned to shout up the cellar stairs in English. "Michaels, get down here, and bring some of those rations from the supply truck." Rations. Food. Peter's mind struggled to process this. They weren't being executed. They were being ... fed. Sergeant James Sullivan was 32 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania where he'd been a high school football coach before the war. He'd enlisted in 1942, fought through North Africa and Sicily, landed at Normandy, and spent the last 11 months pushing through France and into Germany, watching the German army collapse from a formidable fighting force into a desperate collection of old men and children, defending ruins with empty promises and inadequate weapons. He'd seen a lot in this war, but nothing had prepared him for capturing 11 boys who looked like they should be worrying about homework and girls and baseball, not crouching in cellars waiting to die for a cause that was already lost. His orders were clear: take prisoners, process them, send them to the rear for detention. Standard procedure. But standing in that cellar, looking at children who'd been conscripted and abandoned, and lied to, Sullivan felt something beyond professional duty. He felt a rage at the regime that had done this, that had sacrificed its own children in a final spasm of pointless violence. And he felt a determination to do something, however small, to counteract that cruelty. "You boys hungry?" he asked through Peter's translation. The boys stared at him, uncomprehending. One of them, a thin child who couldn't have been more than 13, began crying quietly, convinced this was psychological torture before the inevitable execution. Sullivan recognized the fear. He'd seen it before in prisoners who'd been taught that Americans were monsters, who expected cruelty because propaganda had promised it. The best way to break that fear was through actions rather than words. Private Michaels descended the stairs carrying a box of C rations. He stopped at the bottom, looking at the German boys with an expression that mixed pity and anger. "Jesus, Sarge, they're just kids. I know, give them the food. All of it. But that's all of it, Michaels." "Now," Michaels obeyed, opening the box and distributing ration packets to each boy. The Germans took them hesitantly, suspiciously, unable to believe this was real. Some held the packets without opening them, convinced they were poisoned or contaminated, or some elaborate trick. Sullivan watched this, understanding their suspicion, knowing the trust would take time. "Peter, tell them the food is safe. Tell them they're prisoners now, not enemies about to be executed. Tell them they'll be processed and sent to a POW camp where they'll stay until the war ends. Tell them ... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tell them the war is almost over, and they're lucky they'll survive to see what comes after." Peter translated, his voice shaking, and slowly the boys began opening their rations. Inside were cans of meat, crackers, chocolate bars, cigarettes. More food than most of them had seen in weeks, possibly months. The regime's supply lines had collapsed, and the Volkssturm had been equipped with whatever scraps remained: old rifles, minimal ammunition, virtually no food beyond what they could scrounge from destroyed villages. One boy, the 13-year-old who'd been crying, bit into a chocolate bar and immediately vomited from eating too fast on an empty stomach. Sullivan knelt beside him, speaking gently despite the language barrier, offering water from his canteen, demonstrating through gestures that the boy should eat slowly, take his time, let his body adjust. The kindness was more shocking than the food. An hour later, after the boys had eaten and their immediate terror had subsided into wary uncertainty, Sullivan made a decision. The rain had stopped. Afternoon light was filtering through the ruins, and his unit had established a temporary command post in a partially intact building down the street. The field kitchen was operational, preparing food for American troops who'd been fighting for days with minimal rest. "Bring them outside," Sullivan told his squad. "Let's get them some real food." The boys emerged from the cellar, blinking in the gray afternoon light, seeing for the first time the full extent of Aachen's destruction. The city looked like it had been chewed up and spit out, buildings reduced to shells, streets cratered by artillery, the smell of smoke and death hanging in the air despite the rain. This was what they'd been defending, what they'd been told to give their lives for. Ruins and corpses and the ash of a civilization that had consumed itself. American soldiers watched the German prisoners with mixed expressions. Some looked angry. These were the enemy, after all, however young. Others looked sympathetic, recognizing that these were children who'd been victimized by their own government's desperation. A few looked away entirely, unwilling to confront what it meant that they were fighting boys barely into their teens. At the field kitchen, a cook named Rodriguez looked at the German prisoners and then at Sullivan with an expression of disbelief. "Sarge, you want me to feed them? They're prisoners. They're kids who haven't had a decent meal in weeks." "Yeah, I want you to feed them. Make them hamburgers." "Whatever we've got. Hamburgers? For German prisoners?" You got a problem with that, Rodriguez? The cook studied Sullivan's face, recognized that this wasn't a request that allowed for debate, and shrugged. No problem, Sarge. Hamburgers it is. 20 minutes later, 11 German boys sat on rubble eating American Hamburgers beef patties on white bread, with cheese if they wanted it, pickles, ketchup, mustard. Simple food by American standards, but to boys who'd been starving on scraps for weeks, it was a feast beyond comprehension. Peter sat beside Sullivan, eating slowly, still half convinced this was a dream or hallucination, that he'd wake up back in the cellar waiting for execution. The hamburger was the best thing he'd ever tasted, not because of any special quality in the food itself, but because of what it represented, that he was alive, that he'd survived, that the nightmare might actually be ending. Why? Peter asked in English, the question covering everything. Why feed them? Why treat them kindly? Why show mercy to enemy soldiers, however young? Sullivan took a bite of his own hamburger, chewed thoughtfully. Because you're kids. Because this war is already over, even if Germany hasn't officially surrendered yet. Because ... double quotes. He paused, looking for words. Because treating prisoners decently is what separates us from the regime that conscripted you. We follow rules. We don't shoot children. We don't starve prisoners. We do things right even when it would be easier not to. The propaganda said Americans were ... barbaric? Cruel? Yeah, I bet it did. And some propaganda about America isn't wrong. We've got problems, got plenty of darkness in our history. But this? He gestured to the German boys eating hamburgers. This is us trying to be better than the worst versions of ourselves. This is us choosing to follow rules and treat people with decency because it's right, not because it's easy. Peter absorbed this, his worldview continuing to fracture and rebuild itself in real time. In Germany, they told us Americans hated us, that you would destroy our culture, enslave our people. And what do you think now? Peter looked at his half-eaten hamburger, at the American soldiers who'd given enemy children food and water and kindness. I think they lied about many things. Yeah, they did. Question is what you do with that knowledge. While Peter talked with Sullivan, the other German boys processed their own versions of this experience, each struggling to reconcile propaganda with reality, expectation with what was actually happening. The youngest, a boy named Klaus, who turned 13 2 weeks before conscription, sat beside an American corporal named Martinez, who'd taken it upon himself to make sure the kid ate slowly and kept the food down. Martinez had a son back home, same age as Klaus, and the resemblance was enough to break through any anger he might have felt about treating enemy soldiers. Easy there, buddy. Not so fast. You'll make yourself sick again. Klaus didn't understand the English words, but understood the tone protective, paternal, the voice of someone who cared whether he lived or died. It was a tone he hadn't heard since leaving his village 3 weeks ago, since his mother had cried and begged the Volkssturm recruiters to leave her baby alone, since he'd marched away to defend a homeland that was already lost. He ate his hamburger in small bites, as instructed, and felt something inside him that had been clenched tight since conscription began to loosen. Fear was fading, replaced by exhaustion and confusion, and the tentative possibility that he might survive this after all. Nearby, 16-year-old Hans Dieter maintained his hostility despite the food. He was the oldest of the captured boys, the most indoctrinated, the most committed to the regime's ideology. He joined the Volkssturm voluntarily, believing the propaganda about German superiority and American barbarism, convinced that dying in defense of the homeland was glorious and necessary. The hamburger complicated his worldview. So did the American sergeant who'd ordered it prepared, the cook who'd made it despite visible reluctance, the soldiers who watched German prisoners eat with expressions ranging from pity to resignation. None of this matched what he'd been taught about the enemy. An American private, seeing Hans's hostile expression, commented to his companion, "That one still thinks he's fighting for something." Give him time. Reality has a way of breaking through eventually. Hans heard this, didn't understand the English words, but understood the tone dismissive of his beliefs, pitying of his commitment. It made him angry in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The anger helped. Anger was familiar. Anger fit the propaganda's narrative. Anger allowed him to maintain the certainty that had sustained him through conscription and the chaos of combat. But doubt was creeping in. The hamburger in his hands was evidence against everything he'd been taught. Americans weren't supposed to feed German prisoners, weren't supposed to show mercy to enemies, weren't supposed to treat captured soldiers, especially child soldiers, with anything resembling human decency. Yet here he sat, eating American food, alive when he'd expected to be dead, processing the uncomfortable reality that perhaps the regime had lied about more than just the war as likely outcome. After the meal, Sullivan's unit began the formal processing of prisoners. Names recorded, ages verified, physical condition assessed. A medic examined each boy, noting malnutrition, minor wounds, the physical toll of 3 weeks in improvised uniform with minimal supplies. The medic, a lieutenant named Shaw, kept shaking his head as he worked. 13 years old, and they put him in uniform. Jesus Christ, what kind of government does this? A desperate one, Sullivan answered. One that's lost the war and won't admit it. These kids are going to carry this for the rest of their lives. Even if we treat them perfectly from here on out, they're still going to remember being conscripted at 13, sent to fight with inadequate weapons, captured by the enemy while expecting execution. Maybe, but they'll also remember American soldiers giving them food and medical care. They'll remember that the enemy wasn't what propaganda promised. That's worth something. Is it enough? Sullivan had no answer to that. He wasn't sure anything could be enough to counteract what these boys had experienced, what their own government had done to them. But treating them with decency was the bare minimum, and bare minimums mattered when the alternative was cruelty. The processing took 2 hours. The boys were photographed, assigned prisoner numbers, given paperwork that would follow them through the detention system. Throughout this, they remained mostly silent, watching everything with wary uncertainty, waiting for the moment when American kindness would reveal itself as prelude to cruelty. The moment never came. They were treated with professional efficiency, neither particularly kind nor cruel, just processed according to regulations that said prisoners deserved certain treatment, regardless of age or nationality. As evening approached, trucks arrived to transport the boys to a rear area processing center, where they de-joined other prisoners awaiting transfer to POW camps. Before they left, Sullivan gathered them one more time, speaking through Peter's translation. You boys are going to a camp where you'll stay until the war ends. That won't be much longer weeks, maybe days. You'll be given food, shelter, medical care. You'll be treated according to international law. When Germany surrenders, you'll eventually be sent home to your families. He paused, looking at each face in turn. I want you to remember something. You were lied to. About the war, about America, about what happened if you were captured. You were conscripted and abandoned by people who didn't care if you lived or died. But you survived. And you're going to keep surviving. When you go home, tell people the truth about what you experienced. Tell them the enemy wasn't what propaganda claimed. Tell them that Americans followed rules and showed mercy, even when they didn't have to. Peter translated this, and the boys listened in silence. Some nodded. Others remained skeptical. Hans Dieter glared with lingering hostility. But all of them heard the words, processed them, added them to the growing pile of evidence that contradicted everything they'd been taught. As they climbed into the trucks, Klaus, the 13-year-old, turned back to look at Sullivan and Martinez. He raised his hand in a small wave, a gesture of gratitude he couldn't express in words. Martinez waved back, his face showing emotion he didn't try to hide. I hope he makes it home okay, Martinez said quietly. He will, Sullivan replied, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. And when he does, He'll tell people about the American corporal who made sure he ate slowly so he wouldn't get sick. That story will matter 20 years from now when these kids are adults building a new Germany. That story will be worth more than any propaganda. The POW processing center outside Brussels was a massive operation, handling thousands of German prisoners as the Western Front collapsed and German resistance crumbled. The boys from Aachen arrived late in the evening, were assigned to a barracks designated for young prisoners, and found themselves among dozens of other teenagers who'd been conscripted in the war as final desperate months. The barracks were crowded, but adequate bunk beds, blankets, a stove that provided some warmth against the April chill. Most importantly, there was food. Regular meals, modest but sufficient, provided according to Geneva Convention requirements. After weeks of near starvation, the boys couldn't quite believe the abundance. Peter found a bunk near Klaus, the two of them gravitating toward each other as the youngest and the most traumatized. That first night, Klaus cried quietly, processing everything that had happened, grieving for the childhood he'd lost, trying to accept that he'd survived when survival had seemed impossible. "I thought they would shoot us," Klaus whispered in German. "I was so certain. I'd made peace with dying. I know. I thought the same. But they gave us hamburgers instead. Why? Why would the enemy do that?" Peter thought about Sergeant Sullivan's words, about rules and decency and choosing to be better than the worst versions of yourself. Because they're not who we were told they were. Because the propaganda was lies. Because ... He searched for words. Because some people follow rules even in war, even when treating enemies, even when it would be easier to be cruel. Across the barracks, Hans Dieter lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with cognitive dissonance that threatened to break him. Everything he'd believed had proven false. The promised German victory was a lie. The characterization of Americans as barbaric was a lie. The righteousness of the regime's cause was a lie. The wisdom of the leadership was a lie. If all that was false, what remained? What did he believe in? Who was he without the ideology that had shaped his understanding of the world? He had no answers. Just anger that was slowly transforming into something else, grief. Perhaps for the version of reality that had died when an American sergeant had ordered hamburgers for captured children instead of having them executed. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The news reached the POW camp amid mixed reactions from prisoners. Relief that the fighting had ended. Grief that Germany had lost. Fear about what awaited them when they eventually returned home. The boys from Aachen processed the surrender each in their own way. Klaus felt primarily relief. Hans experienced it as personal failure, as if he'd somehow betrayed Germany by surviving when he should have fought to the death. Peter saw it as an inevitable conclusion to a war that had been lost years earlier, but which leadership had been too proud or deluded to acknowledge. Life in the camp settled into routine. Meals 3 times a day. Work details that kept prisoners occupied, cleaning, maintenance, helping with camp operations. English classes where willing prisoners could learn the language. Recreation time where they could play cards, read books from a small library, simply exist without immediate threat of death. It was, paradoxically, the most stable period these boys had experienced in months, possibly years. The war had been chaos cities bombed, families scattered, normal life suspended indefinitely. But the POW camp had structure, had rules, had the routine that humans needed to function. Peter became an unofficial translator, his English improving through constant use, his role giving him purpose and status among the prisoners. He translated for guards, helped newer prisoners understand camp rules, served as bridge between German captives and American captors. Through this work, he got to know some of the American guards, particularly a sergeant named Williams, who taught history before the war and who saw the prisoners as future German citizens rather than permanent enemies. "You boys are going home eventually. Williams told Peter during one conversation. When you do, you're going to help rebuild Germany. The question is what kind of Germany you build. Will it be based on the same lies and hatred that led to this catastrophe? Or will you build something better? How can we build anything? We're just children. We have no power, no authority. You have voices. You have memories. You have the truth of what you experienced here, that Americans treated you with decency when propaganda said we'd be cruel. That truth is more powerful than you realize. Tell it persistently enough, and it changes what people believe. Change enough beliefs, and you change the society. Peter thought about this often in the weeks that followed, about the power of individual testimony, of truth spoken against propaganda, of memories that contradicted official narratives. The hamburger that Sergeant Sullivan had ordered for captured children seemed like such a small thing, but it was evidence against lies, proof that enemies could choose mercy, demonstration that rules mattered even in war. Maybe that was enough. Maybe small truths accumulated into larger change. Maybe the story of 11 boys who expected execution but received food instead would ripple forward through time, told and retold, shaping how the next generation understood the war and the world. Peter wrote a letter home in June, after weeks of uncertainty about whether his family had survived, whether Stuttgart still stood, whether the postal system functioned enough to deliver mail to occupied Germany. The letter was remarkable for its honesty. Dear Mother and Father, I am alive and well in an American POW camp near Brussels. I apologize for not writing sooner, but communications have been difficult, and I wasn't certain you'd survive the war's final months. I want to tell you what happened to me, not because I think you need to know every detail, but because I need you to understand what I learned. I was conscripted into the Volkssturm in April, given 3 weeks of inadequate training, and sent to defend Aachen with no real weapons or supplies. We were captured by American infantry and expected to be executed. That's what the propaganda had taught us would happen. Instead, they fed us. The American sergeant ordered hamburgers for us. Actual hamburgers, with cheese and pickles and everything, when they could have just given us basic rations or nothing at all. He told us the war was over, and we were lucky to have survived. He was right. The war was over. Germany had lost, and everything we'd been told about American brutality was lies. They follow rules here. They treat prisoners according to international law. They show mercy even when they don't have to. I'm writing this because I think Germany needs to hear it. We need to understand that we were lied to about fundamental things, not just about whether we were winning, but about who the enemy was and what kind of people they were. If we're going to rebuild, we need to build on truth rather than the propaganda that destroyed us. I'll come home when they release me. I don't know when that will be, but when I do, I'm going to tell everyone. I meet about the American sergeant who ordered hamburgers for German children instead of having them shot. That story matters more than you might think. With love, Peter. The letter was censored, read by American officials checking for security violations or inappropriate content, then approved for mailing. The censor who read it made a note in his report. Prisoner appears to have learned important lessons about propaganda and reality. Recommend continued decent treatment to reinforce these lessons. Peter was among the first groups repatriated, his age and non-combat role qualifying him for early release. The journey home took days by truck and train through destroyed landscape, past cities reduced to rubble, through a Germany that barely resembled the country he'd left. Stuttgart had survived better than many cities, though it bore scars from Allied bombing and the final chaotic weeks of German collapse. His family home was damaged, but standing. His parents had survived, as had his younger sister. His older brother was missing, presumed dead on the Eastern Front. When Peter walked through the door, his mother collapsed in tears, having believed him dead for months. His father embraced him with shaking hands, examining him for injuries, marveling that his son had survived when so many hadn't. That evening, after the initial emotional reunion, Peter told them everything. About the conscription, the inadequate training, the 3 weeks of chaos defending Aachen. About the capture and the expectation of execution. About Sergeant Sullivan and the Hamburgers, and the realization that everything they'd been taught about Americans was propaganda. His father listened in silence, and when Peter finished, the older man said quietly, "I'm glad they were decent to you. I'm glad someone showed you mercy in this nightmare. Aren't you angry that I'm saying the enemy was better than our own government?" Angry? No. Relieved. If you'd come home full of bitterness and hatred, wanting revenge, planning to keep the cycle of violence going, that would have broken my heart. But you came home having learned that enemies can be humane, that propaganda lies, that building something better requires truth. That's exactly what Germany needs. Peter's mother was less certain. You'll be careful who you tell this to? Some people won't want to hear that we were wrong, that the enemy was decent. They'll call you a traitor, a collaborator. Let them. Germany can't rebuild on the same lies that destroyed it. Someone has to tell the truth. 20 years after the war, Peter Keller stood in a university lecture hall in Munich, teaching history to German students who'd been born after the war, who knew the conflict only through books and family stories and the physical scars it had left on their cities. He'd become a historian specifically to tell his story, to ensure that his generation's experiences weren't forgotten or sanitized, to fight against any attempt to rehabilitate the regime's reputation or excuse its actions. Today, he told his class, I want to tell you about the day I was captured by American forces in April 1945. I was 14 years old, conscripted into the Volkssturm 3 weeks earlier, given a rifle I barely knew how to use, and sent to defend a city that was already lost. The students listened with varying degrees of attention. One raised her hand. "Professor Keller, what happened when you were captured?" "I expected to be executed. The propaganda had taught us that Americans showed no mercy, that capture meant torture and death. Instead, they fed us. An American sergeant named Sullivan ordered hamburgers for 11 captured German boys. Actual hamburgers, prepared by a field kitchen, served to enemy soldiers who'd been shooting at his men hours earlier. Why would they do that? Because they followed rules. Because they'd decided that treating prisoners decently was more important than revenge or cruelty. Because ... double quote. Peter paused, choosing his words carefully. Because they understood that how you treat your enemies says more about you than about them. They chose to be better than the worst versions of themselves. Another student spoke up, a young man in the back row. But isn't that just propaganda too? Americans trying to make themselves look good? Perhaps. But here's the thing. Propaganda that's true is just called truth. They did feed us. They did follow Geneva Convention rules. They did treat captured children with decency when they could have done otherwise. Those facts don't change whether we call them propaganda or history. What happened to the other boys? The ones captured with you? Peter had kept in touch with some of them over the years. Klaus became a teacher, like me, educating young Germans about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. Hans, the oldest, the one who'd believed most strongly in the regime, had a harder time. Struggled for years with what he'd believed versus what had actually happened. Eventually became a journalist, wrote extensively about how to recognize and resist manipulation. And the American sergeant? Sullivan? I tried to find him after the war. Wrote letters to the U.S. Army, checked records, eventually hired someone to search. He died in 1953, heart attack, back home in Pennsylvania. Never knew how much his decision to order hamburgers for German prisoners had mattered. Never knew that one of those boys had spent 20 years teaching thousands of German students about the moment when propaganda collapsed before reality. The class fell silent, processing this. Finally, the first student spoke again. "What's the lesson, Professor?" "What are you trying to teach us?" That propaganda works until it encounters undeniable truth. that individual acts of decency ripple forward through time in ways their perpetrators never witness, that how we treat our enemies defines us more than how we treat our friends, and that rebuilding from catastrophe requires truth uncomfortable, inconvenient truth that contradicts comfortable narratives but provides the only foundation worth building on. He paused, looking across the classroom. In 1945, I was a starving, terrified child who'd been lied to about everything that mattered. An American sergeant fed me and told me the war was over, and I was lucky to have survived. He was right. I was lucky. And I've spent 20 years making sure that luck mattered, that my survival served some purpose beyond mere existence. By teaching history, by teaching truth, by ensuring that Germany's next generation understands what propaganda cost us, what lies destroyed us, what decency saved us. That's the lesson of the hamburger, students. Small acts of humanity can defeat massive systems of hatred if we remember them, if we tell the stories, if we insist that truth matters more than comfortable lies. 30 years after the war, Peter received a letter forwarded through several addresses. Inside was a brief note. Dear Dr. Keller, you don't know me, but my father was Sergeant James Sullivan. He died 20 years ago, but before he did, he told me stories about the war. One story in particular about 11 German boys captured in Aachen, about ordering hamburgers for them, about a kid named Peter who spoke English and translated. I'm writing because I found your name in Dad's war journal. He kept notes, wrote about what he saw and did, and your group was mentioned several times. He wrote, fed 11 German kids today. Youngest was 13. What kind of war puts children in uniform? We gave them hamburgers. It felt important to do something right in this wrong war. I wanted you to know that the decision mattered to him too. And he talked about it years later, wondered what happened to those boys, hoped they'd survived and built good lives. I think he'd be glad to know one of them became a historian, spent his career teaching about propaganda and truth. If you'd like to write back, I'd be honored to hear from you. Sincerely, Michael Sullivan. Peter read the letter 3 times, then sat down to write a response. He told Michael about that day in April 1945, about expecting execution and receiving food, instead about the cognitive dissonance of propaganda meeting reality, about the 30 years he'd spent teaching German students that enemies could choose mercy, that rules mattered, that individual acts of decency could change lives in ways their perpetrators never witnessed. He ended with, your father saved my life twice. Once by not having me executed, which was the minimum required by law, and once by feeding me, which was kindness beyond requirement. The first saved my body. The second saved my soul, taught me that humans could be better than the worst versions of themselves, even in war. I've spent 3 decades trying to pass that lesson on. Thank you for letting me know he cared too. The correspondence continued for years. Peter and Michael became friends through letters, sharing stories about fathers and wars and the long shadows cast by historical trauma. In 1978, Michael visited Munich, and they met in person, the son of the American sergeant and the German prisoner, sitting in a cafe in a rebuilt city, talking about hamburgers and propaganda, and how individual acts of kindness could echo through generations. He would have liked you, Michael said. Dad, he would have been glad to know the kid who translated for him became a historian teaching truth. Tell me about him. What was he like after the war? Quiet, thoughtful. He didn't talk about the war much, but when he did, he always came back to the same theme, that how we treat people matters, especially when we don't have to treat them well. He said the war taught him that rules and decency were what separated civilization from barbarism, and that giving up on either was how you lost your soul. Peter nodded slowly. He taught me that too, without knowing he was teaching, without any pedagogical intent, just through his actions. The hamburger was a lesson more powerful than any lecture. A hamburger is historical turning point, Michael smiled. Not exactly how they teach history in schools, but it's the truest kind of history. Not the grand battles and famous speeches, but the small moments when people choose kindness over cruelty, when they follow rules, even when easier not to, when they treat enemies like humans instead of categories. Those moments matter more than we acknowledge. They're what actually changes hearts and minds. They're what rebuilds civilizations from ruins. They sat in silence for a moment, two men connected by a moment 30 years past, when one man as father had chosen to feed captured children instead of treating them as enemies deserving only minimum consideration. That choice had rippled forward through 3 decades, shaping lives and careers and the education of thousands of German students, who learned that propaganda could be defeated by truth, that enemies could show mercy, that individual decency could matter, even in history's darkest moments. "Thank you for coming," Peter said eventually, "for finding me, for letting me tell your father's story properly. Thank you for remembering, for making his choice matter, for ensuring that the hamburger wasn't just a meal, but a lesson that changed how a generation understood the world." They finished their coffee and walked through Munich's rebuilt streets, talking about fathers and wars and the long work of healing historical trauma through truth and memory, and the persistent insistence that small acts of kindness deserved remembrance alongside grand battles and famous speeches. The hamburger had been 30 years ago, but its lesson persisted, carried forward by a man who'd been 14 when he learned that enemies could choose mercy, that propaganda dissolved before reality, that sometimes the most important historical moments happened in cellars and field kitchens rather than on battlefields and in government halls. Peter had spent 3 decades teaching that lesson, would spend however many years remain doing the same, because the alternative, forgetting, sanitizing, allowing comfortable lies to replace uncomfortable truths, was how the next catastrophe began. Memory was responsibility. Truth was obligation. And the hamburger served to captured children was a lesson worth teaching forever.